Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You're welcome to add any comments about where you're joining us in the chat. Thanks for coming, no matter what time zone you're presently in. My name is Katrina Lewis, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our second event for Critical AI in the Art Museum, Politics and Practices, an extended discussion of the political economy and data practices that inform AI imaginaries proliferating inside and outside the Art Museum. I'm joined by Erica Molesworth, who will be helping moderate the event. The program is brought to you by the Computational Culture Lab in the School of Art and Design at the Australian National University here in Canberra. And I'd like to acknowledge these are the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And in the wake of the recent Australian referendum, I'm aware this gesture of acknowledgement remains frustratingly in the realm of the performative and the symbolic. And at a time when progressive steps towards recognition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Australian Constitution have been stymied, the quest for self-determination and substantive rights for our First Nation colleagues and their communities remains critically urgent. In our first event last week, we were joined by the artist Hito Stahl, who in delivering her lecture, Subprime Images, offered an introduction to the statistical renderings generated by text-to-image models, arguing that DALL-E and Stable Diffusion are onboarding tools normalizing a new political economy of visual production, whose pixel supply chains rely on kidnapped data from the commons that are privatized and repackaged as an asset to be sold back to the public. In this sense, she suggested, any image generated is a collective rendering, a product of collective authorship, prompting the question of how the benefits of such models, if any, might be redistributed to all. In our second event, I'm hoping we will be able to think through the possibilities and limits of free open culture in relation to data-intensive machine learning models and methods, which translates all aspects of social and cultural life, including the World Wide Web, into training data. As we heard in the discussion last week, this has created some confusion about what progressive data practices might look like. And rather than deliver a verdict, I'm hoping we can begin to map the contours of the discussion from different cultural and epistemic communities. It's worth noting that the museum sector has been a major supporter of Creative Commons licensing, and we have witnessed the diligent digitization of major collections in the name of democratic access and open innovation and related initiatives such as Europeana. During the same period, we have seen cash-strapped museums take part in the enclosure of artworks in the public domain through control of their digital reproductions and enter into partnerships with Google, Microsoft, and Meta. The question of how and whether cultural institutions should be defending digital public space has become a prevalent question in Europe, whilst a number of artist researchers have been active in critiquing the limits of open. Adam Harvey's Megapixels project addressed reuse and the meaning of consent in the context of Creative Commons licensing and facial recognition models, while Constance, Authors of the Future project, offers a critique of copyleft licenses grounded in a, quote, hyper-individualistic model of authorship that perversely reaffirms the author as a romantic solitary genius that does not help in any way the organization of collaborative creation with other humans or machines. Their development of the CCR4 license, Advancing Creative Conditions for Reuse, is one attempt to develop a license that considers authorship to be part of a collective cultural effort that they state is informed by intersectional feminist anti-colonial work that reminds us there is no tabula rasa, no original or single author, that authorial practice exists within a web of references. The question of consent and collective access to data as a cultural, strategic, and economic resource also informs the global movement for Indigenous data sovereignty, which gained significant momentum before and during the COVID pandemic, and highlights the legacy of colonialism and epistemic injustice that underpins the collection and circulation of data. Scholarship and policy making in this area affirms Indigenous peoples' right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, and highlights how Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies might contribute to the global conversation regarding society and AI. And I'm really excited that tonight we have two fabulous speakers approaching the governance of and culture of data at this current moment from two different geographies. Our first speaker is Paul Keller, who is Director of Policy at Open Future and President of Communia Association for the Public Domain. For more than 20 years, Paul has been advocating for more open, fair, and inclusive digital policies in Europe and beyond. He has worked on building open content licensing systems, increasing access to digitized cultural heritage, reforming EU copyright policies, and promoting digital public spaces. Thanks, Paul, for joining us so early in the morning where you are. Our second speaker is Maui Hudson, who is a member of the Waikato Nation in New Zealand. He is an associate professor and director of the Te Kotahi Research Institute in the University of Waikato. His work is focused on Indigenous ethics, Indigenous genomics, and Indigenous data sovereignty. Thank you, Maui, for joining us so late in your evening. Unfortunately, our third speaker had to withdraw at short notice, and despite our best efforts, we were unable to secure someone in her place. However, there are many expert artists and scholars invested in the question of open culture, AI, and the commons, and we invite you to share your perspectives in the extended discussion that follows. So I will now hand over to our chair for this evening, Nicolas Malevé. He is an artist, programmer, and data activist who lives between Brussels and Aarhus, with a long history of engagement with the open movement. He is presently a researcher in the School of Communication and Culture, Aarhus University, and a member of Constant and the Scandinavian Institute for Computational Vandalism. Nicolas, please take to our screens.
Thank you, Katrina. Welcome, everyone, and I will start with a few housekeeping notes. So you will notice we are not running this panel in webinar mode, which means we can all enjoy each other's collective presence. However, this means that we have muted all your microphones to avoid sensory overload. Also, we are recording this event. If you'd like to remain anonymous, please change your name and keep your camera off. Our panelists will be speaking for about 20 minutes each, leaving plenty of time for discussion at the end. We have activated the Q&A module to manage this, so help us by submitting your questions there at any point during the event. When it comes to Q&A time, you will have the opportunity to unmute and ask your question live. Please append to your question if you would prefer us to ask her on your behalf. On a personal note, as Katrina said, I've been involved many years in the collective Constant in Brussels, where we have experienced with the creative and political potential of free licenses in many collaborative projects. If my heart still stands for the generous practices that developed in this framework, along with many other companions, my awareness of the shortcomings and problems of an ethos of openness has grown. As Katrina mentioned, the recent work of the people of Constant involved in the crafting of the conditions for reuse license has renewed my interest in the matter. And in parallel, my work on computer vision datasets made me particularly aware of the extractive nature of current AI systems and the need to rethink our relation to the visual commons in response to its instrumentalization. Therefore, it's my great pleasure today to chair this panel for two reasons. The first is because our guests offer a precise diagnosis of the current condition in which data is produced, exchanged, and appropriated. And second, as much as importantly, because each of them comes with new proposals and responses to this current condition. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Paul for his first presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the kind words. And I'm a bit scared that I need to give a precise presentation now, Nicolas, because the topic is so vast, and listening to Katrina's introduction, like this covers so much of my work over the last 20 years. Putting this into 20 minutes in a precise way is quite a challenge. I also listened to Hito's presentation yesterday, and it touched a number of other questions that I didn't have on my mind until yesterday evening before I get to bed. So like feels more like I got chaos in my head than I'll be able to deliver something precise, but let's try. So as mentioned, I've been sort of working on issues related to openness for over 20 years, and I've been involved with a number of organizations that have already been named here. I initially got into this field by setting up Creative Commons in the Netherlands, and have worked quite a while with Creative Commons on developing its tools, etc. And then shifted my attention to the cultural heritage sector, as we say here in Europe, and work with Europeana on the Europeana licensing framework. So very much try to instill this ethos of open sharing, open culture into Europeana, and by extension, like a vast network of cultural heritage institutions around Europe. And I think we've been, at least in the ways that we measured it at that time, quite successful in spreading these ideas and embedding them in institutional logics, etc. I've then spent quite a lot of time in sort of shifted my attention to policy work, and when Europe reformed its copyright laws over the last, or between roughly 2015 and 2020, mainly worked as a lobbyist on a number of copyright issues, partially for Europeana, partially for the cultural heritage sector, but also for civil society on issues that were related more to things like upload filtering. So quite a political fight. And then after that, me and a colleague, Alek Tarkowski in Poland, we set up Open Future, our current organization, mainly out of a desire to think through, to analyze some of the stuff that we had done for the past 20 years, because we felt like there was too little analysis being done on what these ideas about openness, how they possibly changed in parallel with the changes that we observed in the digital environment, which shifted from something which was fairly flat and horizontal in the early years, and we had ideas about democratization and decentralization, towards a hyper-centralized sort of extractive environment. And obviously the question is, what does that do to the ideas that we developed 20 years ago, to things? And so we did so, and let me start sharing my slides here. Give me 1 second. So this should show you my slides now, right? So we did so by identifying something, or we wrote an essay which we called The Paradox of Open. And the paradox of open for us consisted of the fact that, from our perspective, openness is both a challenge to and enabler of concentrations of power. And we still, like, it's a paradox because it's not at all easy and obvious how to disentangle these two qualities of openness, right? Like on the one hand side, where there is concentrations of power in the digital information environment, they are upheld usually by closed systems of exclusive rights, and obviously openness is a challenge to that. And on the other hand, we also couldn't ignore the fact that if you look around, like, those institutions or those entities who would benefit most from openness, who were best equipped to profit from openness, were those who already had the most resources, right? Like the big tech companies are the obvious example in this. And so this is really our starting point for the work that we're doing at Open Future. And we weren't quite sure sort of like where this ride would take us in trying to untangle the paradox of open. We had some hunches. The first hunch being that this needs to be more about the commons and less about openness, so more about if you will, stronger forms of openness, or openness that's sort of like comes with a certain amount of defensive mechanisms, which I guess like is to some way of describing like how commons are understood to function. The second thing was that openness probably can't thrive without, like, on top of like increasingly centralized digital infrastructures, and that there needs to some ideas about digital public infrastructure, which is one of the things that we've worked increasingly on in Europe, saying like there is in addition to regulatory fields, like we also as societies, as sort of stuff takes more place in the digital realm, we also need to like need to have a public digital infrastructure component that some of these things can grow on. So we were looking at these things, and we actually started working on AI quite early. Like one of the first projects that we did was actually with, then he was mentioned already in the introduction, with Adam Harvey, on looking into the questions he identified about openly licensed data sets used for facial recognition training. We've done a sort of, and we felt, for example, at that time that this essentially coalesced around images taken from Flickr, which were licensed under Creative Commons licenses, and we felt that Creative Commons at the time where this came up in 2018 had done like a, you may say, dismal job at dealing with this thing, because they said like this is how the licenses are supposed to work from a copyright perspective. There's nothing wrong, and we really thought to make it clear that this is a much wider thing. There is responsibilities of like a copyright licensing organization that puts these things into the world that go wider than just saying like, well, copyright law hasn't been violated in this case. And there's questions about community norms around this data, governance, shared governance of this data. So this got us on this path, but so we were dealing with AI, if you will, to some degree from very early on in the organization, but then it became clear last summer, I guess, probably to all of us who are here on this call today, that this is a much bigger thing, right? Like with the explosion around what's now called generative AI models, like the image generators, which have been discussed extensively during the opening talk by Hito, but also the large language models, which are sort of like, at least structurally in terms of production, sort of fairly similar to this. And we've approached discussions about AI at Open Future roughly in three different silos: AI and copyright, AI and open source, and AI and the commons, like as we sort of like label them internally, like if we want to figure out, wait, what are we doing right now? It's obviously all like a big intertwined discussion. And let me briefly give you sort of like an idea of what we're working on in these various areas, and then come back to some ideas that we've developed together with others on AI and the commons. So in the AI and copyright space, there's a lot of discussions that center around, and from our perspective, like the interesting thing here is AI and creative labor, and how these AI systems appropriate creative labor or steal creative labor, as some people prefer to say. But this is sort of what's in more technical discussions referred to the input side, right? Like I'm not interested, I find it extremely boring discussion if like what comes out of AI systems is copyright protected or not. Copyright lawyers can spend days, conferences talk about that. But obviously one of the questions is like, what's the relationship and what's the power relations in when sort of like everything that can be found online is used for training AI models. That is very evident in sort of like the image generators, as Hito has explained last week or on Sunday or whenever that was. But also large language models, which basically take all the text they can get from the internet. And there it's interesting, like there's maybe some interesting things, because there's also very specific relationship with the topic of piracy, that a good deal of this stuff seems to be built on top of pirate libraries. So lots of interesting questions around AI and copyright. We know that in the US system, like this is sort of like, the idea is that this will be dealt eventually with fair use. And we see as part of that a lot of lawsuits between different between different groups of artists and creators and rights holders on one side and AI companies on the other side. In the EU, there's actually a much clearer legal system which basically says like this is allowed unless creators opt out from it. And we are trying to, well, like we sort of think that this EU system is somewhat more sensible in this regards. And so part of our work is trying to understand how we can actually make that work in practice. Like there's a number of missing pieces. And so we do a lot of work with policymakers, with stakeholders from rights holder organizations, but also from tech companies, and trying to make this sort of like to give artists choice in this field, like a sort of legal technical reality in the EU. Like the second topic is the sort of that we're dealing with where openness comes in is AI and open source. So a lot of people, and the discussion has shifted dramatically, right? Like it was a very technical discussion, like which sprung up in relationship to the EU and the EU AI Act, which tries to regulate the use of initially only high-risk AI applications in the EU, but by now it's much broader and covers like also what's called general purpose or foundational AI models. So these things that we talk about. And there were some concerns initially that that open source development of AI would be hampered by some of the rules that were in this thing, and that would put open source AI developers at a disadvantage of like closed source AI developers, which we think is a sort of bad thing, because open source comes with a number of advantages, both on the sort of like on the societal level, but also security levels to some degree. So like there is inherent into this model some level of transparency and understandability. There's also the question what open source means in this context. By now, all of this has been a little bit overshadowed, that this sort of like narrative of AI and existential risk, which is very purposefully pushed by like the big players in this space to basically entrench their position, where they say like, this technology is so dangerous that we can't let it be developed open source. You have to trust us as industry leaders to take good care of this. And so there's an attempt to actually crowd out open development of these things. So this becomes to some degree a work that's mainly aimed at defending the right to do AI development in the open. It also becomes like a work which fundamentally questions like, what if this technology is dangerous, why should we let a number of companies develop this in black boxes and under their sole discretion? So this is very much about like also where the power of AI development lies. So it's not about necessarily output, but how these systems are being built. And then
can I interrupt? I just wanted to check that you're advancing your slides, because
it should say AI and the commons. It does say on my slide.
AI, the commons, and the paradox of open?
No, like
okay.
my slides
We're still
advanced.
Stuck on the first slide, I think. So I've had a few requests to rudely interrupt you.
Oh, okay. Sort of like, which slide are you seeing now?
Okay, we're up to the right slide now. Do you want to advance?
Like the other ones, they were sort of boring. Like they were like, okay, this
nothing
one
to see here. Okay.
No. Like the meat is not in the slides. But interrupt me again, because like there's a couple of more substantial slides.
Okay, sure.
So where was I? AI and the commons, and then this is obviously this idea, and like I think Hito touched on that, like towards the end of the presentation and in some of the questions, like what does all of this is like if these AI systems are basically trained on resources that have been implicitly or explicitly commons in the past, like, and it's all extracted, packaged into proprietary systems, and then spit out and published online and fed into sort of all kinds of like distribution algorithms. What does this do to the commons broadly, right? Like, and how can we maintain the sustainability of the commons? We had these examples, which I think were mentioned, where sort of communities and sort of content production arrangements that had sort of characteristics of commons, be that Reddit or Twitter to some degree, things like Stack Overflow, in response to AI, have sort of like closed down. And like I think there's a lot of people who fear about fragmentation on the internet, where people will basically abandon this idea of a big interconnected network and sort of like seek to protect what's theirs or what they care about in sort of close communities. And that is something that we care about a lot. Like, I think we care about like this ideal scenario of like the open internet, where people can broadly sort of like engage on the same terms across the world, right? And so there's mainly questions that we're trying to address here. Is about sort of like, what does commons-based governance of data sets, be that explicit training data sets for AI systems, or like data sets which simply exist as part of previous activities, mean, and how can these direct like the use and deployment of AI systems in sort of like societally beneficial directions. And so we've come to, and I hope like the slides advance now. You should have like something which is a bit like,
No, sorry.
What are you seeing now?
Yeah, we can see your full keynote.
Okay, then then that seems to be like a you get rid of hide presenter notes. This becomes a little bit bigger.
That's completely workable for us.
Okay, so this should be readable, right? Like that hopefully works better. So we've come to like we've got two sort of broadly ideas to make sort of AI work for the commons and creators. On the one hand side, we think that creators have to have the ability to control if and how their works and identity are being used by commercial AI systems. And on the second end, it's also clear to us that we need mechanisms to ensure that a portion of the surplus generated from training AI on humans' collective creativity flows back to the commons, sort of like however you want to define that. But like these two concerns need to go hand in hand. Like we see a lot of, like I think we see a lot of sort of like a combination of both of them in public things, where there's this idea that creators should have control and creators should benefit. We don't think that this exclusive focus on creators does what's happening here any justice. Like I think this sort of image that Hido painted in her talk about the pyramid, that this is like these creative outputs are built on increasingly broad sort of sources of input, which do not only include the previous creativity which has been sucked into the systems, but the people labeling this thing, the work done on training the things, but also like the environmental inputs, etc. Like, so there needs to be a more sort of like this needs to be acknowledged that this is a different sort of like form of cultural or creative production to some degree. And for us, like this needs to both respect like the creators as individuals, but like also the commons as a resource here. And so we've been toying around with these ideas, and we've last month at a Creative Commons event in Mexico, we've worked with like a sort of relatively broad group of stakeholders or like activists, broadly speaking, from across the world on trying to identify a couple of principles for making AI work for creators and the commons. And I'll just walk you through those 7 principles, which are very much like work in progress and things that we would come up after sort of like a couple of days of first a full day seminar and then a number of like smaller discussions. Is that the first principle is that we need to, whatever we do in terms of regulating this technology, we need to ensure that people have the ability to study and analyze existing works in order to create new ones, including through machines, right? Like the fact that machines are involved in this process is not the problem. The second principle here is that we need to ensure that all copyrighted works can be used for training public interest in non-commercial AI systems. So if we come up with defensive mechanisms that sort of limit what sort of commercial appropriation or how these works can be appropriated by commercial entities. We shouldn't repeat the mistake often that we apply these blanket copyright rules, which then also hamper public institutions, public administrations, individuals, small collectives from doing sort of like from working with existing cultural wealth. The third part is that we need to ensure that creators have the right to opt out from the use of their works for training commercial AI systems, which is sort of like, I think, very closely mirrors the first thing that I had on the other side. Then the fourth point is that we need to ensure that stewards of traditional knowledge resources have the right to reduce the use of training, the use of these resources for training AI models. The fifth thing is to ensure that everybody has the right to exclude personal data, likelihood, identity, and things like that from the use of training or from the use for training AI systems. The sixth point is that we need to ensure that the economic benefits of training AI systems, something strange going on here, on publicly available data are shared back with the commons. I think like I sort of like in earlier versions, we used the word taxation in here, like that there needs to be some tax. And I was happy that Hito used that, but like for some of our North American participants in this discussion, like last month, like taxation was a hurdle too far. Although I think what Hito said like last week that, well, we have existing systems for that and they are called taxation is exactly part of the answer here. And then finally, and this is where probably some of this should go from our perspective, is like, so the revenues generated by taxation or however other systems you have, like that we need to invest in building public compute infrastructure and public data sets that are governed as commons as a result of this. So like we actually need to invest in the public conditions to do public work in this space, and in order to extract ourselves from the sort of like almost death grip that the big corporate players have on this. And sort of like when coming here or when preparing for this, I was thinking like, okay, what does this mean in relationship to the title? What does this mean for AI and the archive? And I'm like, sort of like, I have more questions than answers here, but like one of the things that comes to mind, like me speaking to people in the European culture heritage sector to some degree, like a lot of people see like their first response is, okay, we need to prevent like our resources being appropriated for AI training by corporate players. I think we see that from museums, from libraries who think about how can we not feed the Googles and the Facebooks of this world and the OpenAIs. And like I think I want to challenge that to some degree, and like by some way of doubling down on openness here, like just and I think Katrina, you mentioned that in your introduction, right? Like the Google Books thing, right? The Google Books scanning, which was I know that the situation in the US the situation was different. They scanned everything. In Europe, they limited themselves to stuff which was out of copyright. And the big libraries that went into the scanning projects, like did a sort of like devil's bargain with Google and said, you can scan our books, like, and you can have them, all of them, for your exclusive commercial use. And you give us back the copies, and we promise you, like, we let nobody else do anything with the copies for 15 years. And what's the result of that? Like, there's one entity on the planet which has access to all of the books scanned in all of the European libraries, preserved throughout the ages with public money, and they've trained all of the AI on this. And now we're freaking out, or museums are freaking out, how can we prevent others from doing this? No, the point needs to be like, we need to enable everybody else to do this as well. Like we need to like take away this extremely unfair competitive advantage that Google has in this field, and sort of like encourage everybody else to play with this, right? Like that stuff is already, like that has already been appropriated by one entity. And the role of public institutions here ought to be to make sure that this is available to all of our researchers, to all of our artists to, as far as I'm concerned, all of our sort of like small companies who want to do something with it, but sort of like we're sort of like staring at the wrong thing here. And you can make this argument to other things, like, right, the biggest problem at the moment is sort of like that the companies who are leading this AI hype cycle, right? Like who are at the, like, who pretend to be at the cutting edge of this technology. Why are they there? Because they have amassed all of this data. Like Google also happens to be like the sole proprietor of like all of the videos that everybody uploaded to YouTube in the last 20 years, right? Like we need to somehow, instead of saying like, no, you can't have ours, like I think we need to think about ways where we fight for freeing that type of content and making sure that this doesn't only benefit the things. The same as like Google is one leader, Facebook is the other one. Facebook also has obviously, or Meta as it's called right now, like also has been the beneficiary of everybody giving them the content to train their AI on. And this goes on and on and on for all of the, if you look at the companies who are currently leading this, like they're all in these positions because they unfairly appropriated stuff exclusively for themselves. And the answer to that is not that everybody else closes up, but like my gut feeling, and sort of like I might be making the same mistake that we made 20 years ago with these initial ideas about openness, that openness is part of the remedy, like that opening up some of the stuff here is, and like I wish that it's sort of, this is the discussion that takes place within the institutions that are sitting on vast collections of artworks, of knowledge, etc., here in Europe and elsewhere in the world, taking into account like some of these principles, right? Like this must not be a free-for-all. This must be like, if you take something out of it, you need to give back. Like these ideas about reciprocity within sort of commons governance that we, like, I think the so-called open movement has for the longest time ignored, because like actually talking about revenue models and sort of like things like taxation was sort of like a dirty word, in the past. Like we need not forget about these lessons that we had, but like this can't lead us to abandoning openness as a concept, as a remedy for making sure that this doesn't lead to like just a couple of companies running based on kind of like the sneaky ways they've appropriated our data in the past. And I think that's sort of like was a little bit longer than intended, but I hope this was a useful discussion starter.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation, Paul. I think you've really connected very well to previous discussions in the series, but also brought a really great overview of the complexity of what we are facing today. And indeed, this call for not only more legislation, but also public infrastructure will certainly be a very important item of discussion later on. But now, before going into this discussion, I would like to hand the microphone to Maui. So Maui, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, Nicolas, kia ora, Paul, kia ora, Katrina. Thanks for the invitation to be a part of this conversation, and it's really nice to be able to sit here and follow Paul's talk as well. Even though I haven't been familiar with Open Future, a lot of the ideas and things that he was talking about were actually the sorts of things that we were responding to as we started to think about Indigenous data sovereignty, and formed that as a response to what we could see as this push towards open data, push towards open science, push towards open as sort of the way of the future. And what it was, what we could see happening with the really, what we called as well, the appropriation of our knowledge, appropriation of our data in a whole range of different ways. So look, I'm going to share some slides as well, and really just do a sort of a bit of a background. It hasn't necessarily the work I've been doing in the context of art museums or the archives. It's been one of my sort of colleagues, Jane Anderson, who's been a bit more in that sort of space. But I'm sure this should run together and be a setup for some conversations later on. So Indigenous data sovereignty really emerged in about 2016. So sort of as an idea, it's fairly new, but we were really kind of leveraging the conversations that were happening actually around data sovereignty, and data sovereignty being the cloud computing term, which was talking about, data being subject to the laws of the nation within which the data is stored. And just as Paul's been talking about the sort of accumulation of data by companies, there's also the accumulation of that data in certain locations that was then making it subject to laws that would be put in place in different areas. And this was, in particular, as the Patriot Act, I think, came into view, and there was a lot of discussions between different parts of the world, EU in particular, about creating safe havens for where data would be so that it wouldn't be subject to, people going in and searching it in undue ways. And so as we were starting to think about this, and when I'm saying the we, I'm meaning a sort of a range of Indigenous academics and practitioners, primarily across the sort of Kansas states, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the US, that we're thinking about both this sort of shifting of data out of, and if I think about sort of like government controlled spaces and think about archives and museums as sort of state public institutions, but those institutions were shifting that information and that data into areas which allowed other people to, well, essentially allowed companies to start using it in different ways. And there's conversations that were taking place were around, well, what were the rights of individuals? Where did consent come into play in terms of how they would allow that information to sort of shift into those areas, and could they say no to it? And so we were going, well, this isn't just a sort of issue of the individual as well. It's also the group, the community, the Indigenous community, and their right to have a say about not just personal information, but kind of collectively held information. And often traditional knowledge sits in that kind of realm, but it might also work with other communities as well. And so where are the rights or the interests of those communities in this sort of debate? And so this discourse around rights and interests in relation to data emerged, which also had its basis in a lot of the other conversations that were going on, conversations about sovereignty around treaty rights, things around cultural intellectual property, how that sit in the context of intellectual property rights and cultural intellectual property rights, and then different sorts of ideas that people have talked about in terms of research ethics, Indigenous research ethics. And so it's ended up with these sort of two primary themes emerging in Indigenous data sovereignty literature, one around data for governance. And so that was about as communities are wanting to make their own decisions, become more self-determining, getting access to that information is actually really important. Just as Paul was saying, open data will have some benefits. And so being able to access that information would help people with making their decisions. So there was the data for governance component. But also, as that data was being made available to everyone, in what ways could communities be involved in the governance of that data, make decisions about the appropriateness of its use in different contexts? And so what might that look like? And so those were, I guess, some of the kind of initial ideas. And as we were starting to think about what we could do, and recognizing that most of the data that's floating around isn't within the control of Indigenous communities themselves. And therefore, if we're trying to enhance control, but the information's sitting somewhere else, we need to get involved in the kind of data governance sphere. And so the care principles for Indigenous data governance were created. This came about from an assessment we did of a lot of the principles that were being used to promote open data, including things like the FAIR principles. And so when you look at the FAIR principles, they're really talking about the characteristics of the data themselves. It's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, how kind of machines talk to machines and how the data is organized to, facilitate that happening. And when we're looking at the Indigenous principles, they tended to be more about the people and about the purpose. What was the data being used for and who was using it? And so these ideas around collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility, and ethics emerged as the principles for Indigenous data governance, but could sit as a complementary set of principles to the ones promoting openness. And that's where we have this, ended up with this sort of tagline of be fair and care, and have been relatively successful in having care picked up and adopted in a range of kind of global context where people are talking about both of these sets of principles as being important when they're starting to think about data management and data governance. So, this wasn't actually a kind of a formatting issue. This is a sort of intentional activity. How can you govern Indigenous data if you can't find Indigenous data? And this is, one of the big issues that sits in all sorts of archives. There's huge amounts of information that's just kind of stacked in and packed in. And in some ways, I guess the digitization movement is about trying to surface that and make that more findable and accessible to the public. But within these places, there's all sorts of information that's come from Indigenous communities that hasn't necessarily been, I guess, labeled in that way. And so even in the digitization of them, because they've been stored under the name of the collector, by the name of the author, where that sort of provenance sits means that it's difficult for communities to find that information as well. And this is, just one of a series of issues which sit in around these sort of information systems. So knowing that there's, huge collections that are sitting within these archives, museums, and libraries, that often there's significant information about them, individual and community names and proper provenance information is missing. The communities themselves are not the legal rights holders. And there's not just an issue of sort of a historical issue, it's that there's researchers that are working and collecting data and samples from communities more now than ever before. And these issues of ownership and incomplete and significant mistakes in the metadata, as we go through digitization processes, continue into the digital life of that material as well. And so embedding some of those mistakes. So it became an issue of what sorts of things could be done about it. And really thinking about the ways in which copyright and traditional forms of IP sort of are excluding communities from being recognized. Creative Commons is limited in the sense can only be applied as a license if you hold the copyright in the first place. And so that, excludes a lot of communities from being able to apply them in the ways that they might think are possible. And so shifting towards something, different ways of enabling a recognition of Indigenous cultural authority in relation to material as well. And that's one of the projects I've been involved in through thinking about traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. So I think, supporting some of those kind of points that Paul was making about that tension, there's this challenge of competing interests, and even amongst the kind of Indigenous community, there's this elements of our communities that are, focused on increasing participation in research, science, and technology, all of the different spaces, managing in the archives, Indigenous librarians, all of these things are things that we're wanting to increase. As that happens, we end up with increasing support for open data and open science initiatives as it supports the sorts of activities which they're doing. And that's being balanced at the same time as we still maintain these aspirations for Indigenous data sovereignty. So in some ways, trying to, find the line, I think, that people have been talking about, where communities can benefit from that innovation and development and how that comes about. But their way of participating is through greater control of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous data. That's what gives them the opportunity to participate in that activity. It's not necessarily the only way that should happen, but I think a lot of communities feel like it's the only way because of some of the other ways in which they get excluded. So there's a whole range of different sorts of activities going on that are sort of operating in a similar sort of space. And here's a sort of a couple of recent ones that I've been a part of. Just thinking about inclusivity in relation to open science, inclusivity in relation to open libraries, the same sort of language is being used, really assuming that open science, open library is actually the direction. And the challenge is, how do we make that kind of process inclusive rather than questioning, what is the nature of open, and is that the goal that we should all be thinking about? I mean, the positive thing is that I think these groups that are on this trajectory are starting to bump into some of the challenges, the ethical challenges, the cultural challenges, and are wanting to do something about it. And makes them sort of take a step back and think about what are the ways in which we can then connect in a more meaningful way with communities, so we can be directed around which things are appropriate to sit in open space and which things aren't. Similarly, there's sort of discussions that people are having, and this is, I think, similar to some of the conversations that have been had as generative AI is being developed. What kinds of bias sit within those systems, both as a result of using data that has been collected in ways that that generate inequities. And so all we're doing is we kind of shifted into the sort of AI spaces, find different ways to embed that bias and replicate it. And the sorts of conversations and things that have been happening around how to facilitate better benefit sharing, so that whether it's in this instance traditional cultural expressions being used in the fashion industry, and what sorts of partnerships result in more equitable benefit sharing. And so places where that happens, and it certainly doesn't happen well in all places, but there's good examples which you can find. But how do you spread that out across the system in a sort of a more meaningful way, and push into some of these new areas, like we're talking here around data in museums and archives. So I was thinking about Indigenous needs in relation to inclusivity and open sciences. I think that's really something that can think about in this sort of context as well. The sorts of things that communities are talking about is, gaining respect or having respect for their for the use of their information, their knowledge, that kind of recognition of that, and that there's reciprocity. And I know Paul sort of mentioned that word as well. So these are the sorts of things that Indigenous communities are looking for, and how what sorts of actions can we promote and facilitate that ensure that their voice remains a part of the information that's circulating and moving in and out of the commons in different ways. So it might be in the commons, but then kind of shifting into being used in AI context, and then as maybe coming back in, heading in different directions. But their voice and their participation sits there, thinking about different ways that acknowledgement, attribution, authorship, access, and authority can be recognized. And so here's just want to kind of run through a few different examples. Most of these are in the context or around the use of different sorts of notices and labels that have been generated through local context. But here you have a range of different ways in which acknowledgements can be made, just as Katrina did the sort of a land acknowledgement. The land acknowledgement also sit in a digital space. acknowledgements around bias and harmful content, acknowledgements around or notices that talk about open to collaborate as sort of indicating a desire to work more closely with communities. A whole range of different ways that acknowledgement can happen. And then thinking about attribution, and in particular, these are traditional knowledge labels. This specific one actually is about attribution, which gives the community the ability to say how they would like to be recognized and reflected as people use the content which they're making available. And so this is content that sits within Virtual Museums Canada. Information which has been put up, and this all ends up being publicly available, but the community has been able to say, here's how you can refer to us. Similarly, this is a example in the Library of Congress, the use of the traditional knowledge labels here as it relates to some wax cylinder recordings, the first recordings ever made on First Nations territories or American Indian territories. And this is the sort of an updated record after collaboration with the community. One of the important things was how the use of these labels then was reflected within the rights advisory. And so thinking about down here, you can see underneath the 3 traditional knowledge labels, the rights held by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University. So they're the ones that held the kind of the copyright in relation to this material. But these cultural intellectual property rights are being recognized in the same field. And what's just happened in the last year is that Harvard University has asked for their name to be removed from this record. So as something is sitting in that space challenging, their right to be able to claim a right over traditional language, but something else is sitting there in that field that potentially replaces it, they say, hey, it's not right for us to be here, and have stepped back. And similarly, this is, just a sort of a different context. This is around, I guess, sort of plant collections. There's the national collection here in New Zealand, but museums and archives are also becoming a source not only for traditional knowledge and things that have been written, but different sort of samples which they hold, and they're becoming a source for information to be used in different places. And this is the same thing with the label becomes a way for the community to bring their voice onto the record, so that any public user of this open information can see, in some ways, that it's not public domain, but their use of this information might require them to acknowledge some sort of rights and underlying rights and interests that sit there as well. And then just thinking about authorship, and how do you go from a space where you've got a kind of recognition of that authority sitting there, and as things are generated, and so in a kind of a research context, this is one where a notice has been put on a DNA sequence that has been put in a database. But as they've written papers about it, that notice or those labels start to be represented in those products as well, visually on kind of the pictures or the paper, but also on the data availability statement. And we're in the process of sort of engaging with different publishing houses and developing guidelines, both for how journals might do a better job of reflecting Indigenous data sovereignty and the care principles. So one of the things that the label starts to do is, really share with people that are accessing the data. So one of the things I have to say about the labels in particular is that they're extra legal. So they're not kind of legal tools, they're educational. And they're reflecting to users or people that are viewing the information what the appropriate cultural use or cultural ways of accessing and sharing that information look like. And, we've got a range of different labels. There's provenance ones, but in particular here, protocols and permissions. And in some ways, they are similar to, in a different sort of way, to the Creative Commons licenses. But both of them are speaking to this kind of the nuances of access and what appropriate access might look like. At least in the Creative Commons context, it's usually about the creator, the author, the copyright holder that then is the one that's making that determination. With the labels, it's the community that's putting across their perspective in relation to that. And finally, just thinking about authority and different ways in which that can be enabled. And this is just an example of a future acquisitions agreement sitting between the Penobscot Nation and I think this was the Hudson Museum. So that if there's any material that's donated into that space, that the first conversation is about, how that could be given back to the community rather than to the institution. And then there's different ways that it sort of cascades down if that's not what the donor feels is what they want to do. Then they can think about different ways in which aspects of copyright might be given to or vested with the community, or labels are applied so that they can be named as the primary cultural authority. So I think my little sort of connect to this whole kind of context around generative AI. It's one of the things that certainly the Global Indigenous Data Alliance is starting to think about a little bit more, AI and how data is being used rather than the data itself. And I really support that kind of comment that had been made in the introduction about these digitization and open access projects becoming onboarding tools for AI. So if we're thinking about respect, where's the transparency of Indigenous data sources? How can we recognize and label Indigenous interests in AI-generated material, and in particularly around reciprocity, develop pathways for benefit sharing, whatever that looks like. And so, I think there's a bunch of interesting projects around the Data Provenance Project. I think is something that's interesting, the Data Nutrition Project, and the Data Equity Project as well. So a lot of places which we can find inspiration from. So, kia ora.
Well, thank you, Maui, for this extremely inspiring intervention. I think there is a lot of points of connections between the two interventions, and also I think what becomes clear when I was listening to you is somehow how you refer to different political organizations when we try to think about this question. I think the role of, let's say, the individual as the right owner, or as the sort of unit from which the question of openness has been framed earlier, is somehow what is in question now. I think when Paul was talking about or referring to Ito Steil's idea of the pyramids, saying that there is more than the individual author involved in the creation of these resources. But also, in your case, Maui, it's really clear that your sort of reframing of Creative Commons ideas shifts from the individual to the community. In this case, I think there is really a difference also in how these sort of this move from, let's say, author or individual to community is framed in both your interventions. I guess, for instance, for Paul, the importance of let's say, public institutions, for instance, as for instance and also somehow the state as an entity that can issue, for instance, taxes and or the EU as an umbrella institution seems to be a place where somehow this new politics of data can take place. But I guess for you, Maui, this relation with these kinds of institutions, so the state, is perceived from a very different history. And therefore, I guess it's interesting also to remind ourselves that companies are not the only ones to appropriate data, but the state itself has a large history of appropriation. So I'm wondering, like, if you could both comment on where do you place the sort of institution like the museum in relation to these different elements, like the individual creator, the community, and the state? Because I think that in a way, for museums today, this is certainly a very tricky position to negotiate between essentially the funding by the state, also the cooperation with private companies, and also to make space for working with communities. So in a way, I would like you to maybe comment a bit more on the place or the possibility you see for this particular institution, like the museum or the cultural institution, in this debate.
I can start if you want. So I find it more difficult to place the museum in relationship to the state, because like we also, like, even within Europe, where I'm pretty familiar, like we see very different relationships between sort of governments and the cultural sector, and so like it's hard to make really really decisive statements about that. Like I think like the one thing that makes museums and sort of like the broader cultural sector, but like maybe cultural heritage sector in this stage interesting is like, sort of for me always, like the foundational principle is some commitment to broadly define the public interest, right? Like, and it is relatively clear that they preserve and they make accessible, and they are basically central to sort of cultural processes where people go back to previous sort of generations, work of previous generations that is sort of in opposition, like it's very clear opposition to the market, right? Like it's not the market logic. If you compare Amazon to a library, like it's a completely different thing. If you compare a museum or a entity that collects, like an archive that goes broad instead of like having the collections shaped by whatever is in the commercial or even the cultural interest of just the moment, right? Like it's sort of like memory institutions in this sense, but like with a very broad, like for me always what the shift to digital really has the potential to improve this mission of making like making it easier to make sort of collections, knowledge, sort of available, accessible to a broad public, right? Like, and that's the core mission. And like, I think we need to we need to re-understand what this means. Like, I think there is there's a real danger of like maybe what has been difficult, like what's a new challenge here is also like this sort of like abundance of creation that's enabled by these AIs. Like what's the role in there? Like there's studies which say that like AI generators have, like image generators have generated more images in the past year than like in the first, like photography has generated images in the first 150 years of its existence. Like it's 15 billion images or something, which is on the one hand like sounds super expressive. On the other hand, like our culture also has shifted towards like there's like more than 1 billion images created by photography per day these days, right? Like all the sort of selfies and smartphone pictures. So what's the role of sort of also curating what's relevant and what's not in this space? And like I think to some degree there's also an opportunity in here to be to some degree like to anchor certain cultural practices and sort of like beyond doubt to sort of like a text that has been in a book in a library and like the librarian can attest like that book was there 100 years ago, has a completely different quality of text than any other text that can be generated on the fly at the moment. And like so we need to figure out like maybe the role of these institutions is not necessarily in somehow trying to do the public interest function of what the AI companies are doing, but rather provide some other societal checks and balances on what's going on around us.
Thank you, Maui.
Yeah, look, I'm inclined to agree with Paul in a lot of ways. I think the the role of the institution as a public institution is it does sit there, but I think there's a recognition that a lot of them were developed as part of a kind of a colonial legacy, and so the ways in which things were captured and stored kind of sits there in a particular way, and there's a often uneasy relationship between Indigenous communities and those places where their things have been kind of stored, but they've been excluded from. And I know that that's changing in different ways, and a number of institutions are making efforts to kind of engage and partner and collaborate in different ways around collections and how they're looked after. But that this shift that Paul's talking about from that kind of I guess the physical environment into now this sort of digital one, and the sort of digitization of digitization projects that become I guess a basis for then some of the generative activities is something to think about. It's I think it's quite different, that context from the one we sort of think we can deal with and control in a different sort of way around the kind of the physical items, and now that it's sort of kind of so open and enable, and there's definitely I guess in some ways some opportunities there. I think one of the things is it does change the nature of relationships. You can't just say it's we've got this relationship here as this community with this institution, and we can control everything within the context of that relationship. That's kind of things are bleeding out all the time, as it's just sort of impossible to control in the same sort of way, without starting to try and think about what are the worst examples of how AI is being used and the different sorts of kind of legislative approaches and edicts that are starting to come in around trying to limit that. So I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer in it. I think it is this kind of question about sort of relative rights and interests to work through. That there'll be some things that individuals can do, and that may be the ways in which they can consent or refuse to have things. I really liked a lot of those principles that Paul had put up around how the ways in which they should have some degree of control around things being used within sort of AI context, and that sort of spread across a range of levels. And I think that's exactly right, because my information, which I have, is actually also part of a larger community set of information and part of a larger nation set of information, and how that can be used by each of those groups in ways that I think draw on the ways in which people thought about the commons in the past, and how they manage the commons as a set of kind of relative rights and responsibilities is something, you know, that should be being thought about more in the context of how data is used and looked after. And I think the thing with you know, certainly archives and museums is they've got a pool which they can say this represents our commons, and even if it's becomes a sort of a digitization and they're starting to aggregate it with other, you know, with other collections, they can do that as a commons and start to think about what does this look like in terms of our relationships and responsibilities, but also the communities that we're connected to.
Yeah, thank you very much for this answer. I'm still struck by both of you still having trust in these institutions, and especially, I mean, from my experience, I think I have some sort of skepticism in not their willingness, but their ability to manage the tensions that are currently strong upon them. That at the same time they are willing, I'm sure, more and more to cope with, let's say, the various demands and nuances of offering access to their collections, but also they're under heavy pressure most of the time to behave more and more as commercial entities. So I was wondering, like, in a way, the kind of institutions we are dealing with now are also undergoing quite an evolution that probably also inflects how they have to think about their politics of digitization. But more than that,
Yeah.
I was sorry, I was struck by in your presentations to and especially Maui, your careful attention to the process of curation. So in a way, a lot of the work you're doing is, I think, speaking very directly to collection managers and curators, the applications of labels, and seems to really sort of translate a series of political demands into a vocabulary that can be understood in the curatorial practice. But I'm also aware of what Paul has kept insisting on, and the fact that in a way we are dealing with generative AI with a different scale, and a scale that sort of makes this kind of curation really hard. If you think of the current models, they are dealing with data sets of billions of images. So it's very hard to imagine how somebody could really go through them and actually pay this kind of careful attention. So I was wondering, like, what is your position towards these scales that that sort of structurally elude or make very difficult the kind of application of the solution you propose?
So I'll jump in first this time. I'm trying to keep it short. There's a couple of things that sort of struck me as we were getting involved in conversations around Indigenous data sovereignty. One was a conversation here with a cybersecurity researcher, and he was from Singapore, and saying, you know, you guys are always talking about rights. He goes, you know, we don't care about rights. We care about standards and funds. So that's what drives kind of things that we do. And it's sort of one of the things that's always sort of struck me as well, that, you know, it's, you know, how do you get involved in the systems and change the systems to make it easy for people to do the right thing? You know, there's lots of times people would like to do things like provide the proper attribution, but, you know, if the field isn't there within the database, then all of a sudden that becomes a difficult kind of project to get a part of. So, you know, I ended up getting involved in these different sorts of conversations about trying to develop a standard for the provenance of Indigenous people's data. You know, thinking about metadata fields, thinking about, you know, where the labels can sit so that they become a sort of a vehicle for bringing this additional information in. Now, if that information's there, then it becomes easier to create different sorts of relationships going forward. I mean, it's still, it's still going to be up to the person, the institution, the curator to then kind of do that work, but at least they're not having to go out and kind of find some of that stuff. In the same way, as that sort of data is being curated and labeled in a different sort of way, it creates different possibilities for how it can be used by generative AI, by communities, and all sorts of ways, which will, probably have be a double-edged sword in some instances, but on balance, hopefully it's going to be better than the current situation.
I see that in the Q&A we have a question. So it's from Natalia Fuchs. Natalia, would you like to turn on your mic and ask your question, or would you like us to ask it for you?
I think Natalia would like you to ask the question, Nicolas.
Okay. So here is a question to Maui. You employ care ethics principle in accordance with data governance. Could you please elaborate on the care ethic research the most relevant for your work?
Yeah, look, so I was just about to try and type an answer, so it's probably easier to say it. There's a couple of things that are happening at the moment. Certainly, for the last few years, we've really just been trying to create some awareness around the care principles. There's a range of different groups that have started to think about how they might apply in their context. Now, a lot of those places are data repositories, starting to think about their responsibility and the sorts of things they can do. We're working with them to try and develop some criteria for the care principles. Pretty much like what happened with FAIR. The principles were created, and then over time they developed a data maturity model and gave particular things that can happen. So we're in the middle of that phase. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about how the care principles can apply to biodiversity data. And so in that kind of space and realm. But it would be great to see people thinking about and writing a little bit more about how care might apply into the kind of archive space and the museum space as well.
Thank you. I see another question popping up from Adam. Adam, would you like to turn on your mic and ask a question? Maybe then I read it. Thanks for great presentations. My question is, how feasible is it to establish a collective bargaining organization, such as a user union, to monitor and regulate the data collection and usage practices of the big tech sector?
Maybe I can go to that. So I think it's incredibly difficult, right? It is sort of like, given that would need to be an organization that essentially works on global scale with very different within very different settings. It is sort of like, to set up an organization and then negotiate is sort of like, seems to me sort of like a interesting idea, but like an impractical one, right? Like, I think we need some level of taxation of some form, which raises similar questions, right? Like, what's the basis for, like, there's no international forms of taxation, right? Like, from the interesting thing, like the challenging thing, like the really new thing that's going on here from our perspective is that in the past, like, I think nobody really had, like no entity was sort of like able to sort of extract and sort of like directly benefit from that extraction of global creativity, like all of human creation and knowledge at the same time, right? Like we might have been in this intermediary period of the past 20 years where maybe like we all knew like, okay, Google somehow brings everything together and has some benefits of it. But like, I think a lot of us were also like, and yeah, they make useful things in return and it's okay. And now suddenly like, or it's okay, or it's at least there was some kind of like level of a margin there, right? Like, and by now it seems to be like that this ability to just go in and extract and then appropriate is becoming available for more and more entities. And sort of like suddenly this becomes an issue. How do you deal with the thing that sort of humanity's collective production feeds into the proprietary business models of a limited amount of entities that have like the capacity to build out the computational infrastructure, that employ the data labelers and things, that they can benefit from this at the detriment of everybody else, right? And the answer to that is probably, the answer for that is not lying in copyright, which a lot of people think, because copyright just simply doesn't know how to deal with the situation where there's billions of input into a single output, right? Like it hasn't been designed. Like these systems of collective rights management, which somehow try to attribute like certain remunerations to a use, like they break down if you need to divide like the inputs for the use by 5 billion, because like that's sort of so smallish you can't pay this out. So like I think we fundamentally need to have a sort of different way of thinking about this. This is not negotiation. This is sort of like, this is in a way, it's sort of more a question of resource allocation, which is probably more similar to things like pollution or to land use or water use or things like this. There is a collectively created human resource, the sort of like information commons, if you will, that people tap in, and we need to govern this in a way that this is not the exclusive privilege of a few, and that whatever is done by this sort of somehow feeds back into this information commons and sort of like at the minimum sustains it, but maybe like also contributes to correcting some global imbalances in access to this commons, address a number of other questions that exist around sort of access to knowledge and information at this moment. And sort of the biggest problem, like I think, is that, and we see that, like you see that in that way, it's sort of like very analogous to like the climate emergency, right? Like the humanity's capacity to act on a global level is like severely limited by sort of the splintering in different power blocks into different legal systems, into different sort of like different societies that have very different needs because of their sort of like economic or sort of like just geographic situations. How do we act with common? So like, I don't think it's a negotiation between users and tech companies in that sense. Like it's trying to get to grips with sort of a radically changed sort of like, or the emergence of a new global resource that sort of has its limits, and that can't be sort of subjected to the same extractive logic that we've historically done with like global resources, like, I don't know, oil, right? Like that's the wrong approach. We need to learn from that and we need to do better.
So one possibility to think about is the conversations that are taking place around the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol, where you've got fair and equitable benefit sharing around genetic resources, is about to include digital sequence information as a part of that. Now we're kind of the first time that data's been included as something where there needs to be fair and equitable benefit sharing applied to it. And they're talking about a sort of a multilateral fund, shifting from a sort of kind of bilateral to a multilateral. I think it ends up probably being some degree of both. You know, there's always going to be these sort of instances, as Paul mentioned, where you're trying to divide or recognize the contributions from too many people to make it kind of sensible. So, in those sort of instances, applying things into a multilateral fund, which can then be used for kind of general benefit is great. I think in instances where there's an obvious kind of connect with specific communities, then having some sort of more direct kind of benefit sharing arrangement makes sense. But these are all things that will have to be worked out, and try to be kind of managed and facilitated in a kind of really easy process. Anything that gets too hard will just kind of get diverted.
Thank you. I have another question from Melanie Wilming, sorry. And it's a question for you, Maui. What sorts of possibility do you see for indigenous communities to use AI tools for their own purposes? For instance, you mentioned the difficulty of finding indigenous data. Could it be used to digitally search collections and identify things that have been buried?
Yeah, so one of my colleagues has did a little bit of work on that with her students. So Jane Anderson up at NYU had some students create a indigenous data detection algorithm to try and sort of do exactly that. So I'm not quite sure how successful it's been or where exactly it's been applied, but I think that there's definitely a possibility, and there's certainly, I think the conversation is starting to shift a little bit from not just thinking about the control of the data, but actually how it can be used, and how it can be used in ways that are empowering for communities. I think there'll be, there's certainly a capacity challenge for communities want to do it themselves. They don't often have people with the sorts of skills, the coding skills and sort of AI background to be able to do that. So they're often having to collaborate with others. And I think you'll see more and more of that into the future.
I see that Ellie raised her hand. Maybe she wants to turn her microphone and ask the question. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your presentations. So my question is for Nicolas. I was reading a recent paper on machine vision's latency, and it reminded me of Joan's Fontcuberta's digital latency. Do you think with the digital, we've already entered a perpetual state of latency?
Can you explain briefly what Fontcuberta means by latency?
Sure. Yeah, he considered that the shift from film to digital, when we shifted from film to digital, there is a comparison that we make in the latent state. So in the film, in the digital, the latency is in the closed file. So whenever we open the digital image or the photograph, so the latency is reversible in this case. So, okay. Yeah, so if you can elaborate more.
Well, I'm not sure I really get the idea.
Like what is the machine's vision latency? Is it just the theory, or
maybe if I may try to answer your question and try to somehow relate it to probably the reasons why we started this discussion with Katrina and
sure.
And thought about this session is that as both our guests have said, there has been really a lot of discussions about how to frame AI, the issues of AI for museums, in the sense of how does a machine is it an entity that is able to create something that can have a copyright that would replace human creativity? And we were really interested to invert this question and get back to the question, like Paul said, with the word input. So that where does the machine, in a way, what feeds the AI? So we started to think about this question in terms of how can we avoid a sort of mechanistic approach to that. Let's think about the relation between the training data, so the general creativity it feeds from, as just a set of objects that are related each as the property of a certain user. But in a way, if I understand the question about the latency, I would say that this training data and this the sort of political model of how data is shared and data is appropriated is the latency of these models. So what remains, in a way, really somehow present in the way AI generates images is the mode of production, the mode of appropriation of the let's say the commons, the visual commons. So my answer to your question is not very technical. It's more like what kind of world, in a way, remains latent in the way machines operate when they feed off from certain resources, the way they feed from, like the how data, instead of being sort of acknowledged, understood with all the complexity of how it's scattered and constructed, is sort of treated as a sort of given by the systems, and how it's therefore unable to cope with the various nuances and tensions that are inherent to the culture that brought this data alive. So that would be my answer about this question of latency, if that makes sense for you.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's Nicolas. We've kind of come to the end of the questions there, and I'm just mindful that we're now over time. Perhaps we could all unmute and put our hands together for our fabulous speakers and chair. Thank you, Nicolas.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Maui.
you very much to our guests and Katrina for organizing this, and everyone for the questions and the presence.
Thank you.
And join us next week for our next panel, looking at the limits of curatorial education and the modelling of the digital by cultural institutions, with a stellar lineup of museum workers, curators, and blogs. So look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.